empowerment, micromanagement, delegation, decision-making, accountability. One or all of these words get talked about almost any time the topic of leadership comes up, and yet most of them are misunderstood or misapplied. We aim to change that on this very important and practical episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could be with us live for future episodes on your favorite social platform. To learn where they are and when they are and how to get involved, you can just join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do exactly that. Hope you will do that. And today's episode is brought to you by my latest book, Flexible Leadership: Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world that is more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective and a new set of tools to create great results for their organizations and their team members by being a flexible leader. And that's what this book provides you. Learn more and order your copy at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. And with that, I'm going to bring in my guest. You will see him now. I will introduce him and we will dive in. My guest today is Chris Seifert. He is a dynamic leader and founder of Enabling Empowerment, an initiative dedicated to transforming organizational leadership and enhancing team performance. With over 20 years of experience in manufacturing operations and strategic advising, his mission is to empower leaders to elevate their organizations and teams through innovative strategies and methodologies. At Enabling Empowerment, Chris addresses the challenges of micromanagement by offering a comprehensive training and coaching program that guides leaders in creating environments where creativity and ownership can flourish. His approach emphasizes the importance of empowering decision makers at all levels, promoting shared leadership, fostering a culture of collaboration and ownership. He is also the ownership of a brand new book on those ideas. It shares the title of his company. It is Enabling Empowerment. He is my guest. Chris, welcome. So glad to have you on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.
Oh, thanks a lot for having me, Kevin. It's an honor.
So I learned before we started that you haven't done very many of these yet. So I'm excited, right? So hopefully I won't ask anything that's too challenging. And hopefully your answers will feel fresh to all of us listening. And I promise you, everybody, if you haven't gotten your copy, we'll put the link in the show notes. But if you don't have your copy of Enabling Empowerment, we'll tell you how to do that at the end, but be aware and ready for that. So let's start here. Why this book? What's the journey that leads you to this place and why this particular book?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my career has spanned, over 25 years now, and largely in three buckets. One, I spent about 8 years on active duty in the U.S. Navy in the submarine force. And then I spent about 6-7 years as a consultant, doing strategy operations consulting with large oil and gas, chemical, high hazard industries. And then the rest of my career has been in operational leadership roles. I've been a plant manager of 3 different plants. I was a vice president of operations for a large biomass manufacturer that we grew very rapidly over a 6-year period. And over the course of my career, there are two things that I have found that all the teams that I was leading struggled with fundamentally. One of those was root cause analysis. People just tend to not be very good at cause and effect thinking, right? Our brains as humans are wired to correlate, not to define cause and effect. Similarly, the other thing we're not particularly good at is making decisions, especially in the face of uncertainty and risk, right? And complexity. And I found quite a few vendors that were very good at helping me over the years with the root cause analysis portion. But on the decision making, I haven't. And very early on in my career, I had developed a a training where, that I use to teach my teams, I make them better decision makers, so that I could empower them. And we can speak to that as the reason why, in a bit. But I developed that training, and I just had seen that, my teams needed it. I've other leaders that have worked for me and worked with, have leveraged it in their careers. And so I thought, it made sense to, how can we share this with as many people as possible?
Awesome. So, uh, we so far you've really talked about decision making. We're going to spend a lot of our
Right.
time there, of course. But the one of the big words in this
Hmm.
title of the book, title of your company, is the word
Yeah.
empowerment. So, I think it's
Yeah.
probably useful um, to get your definition of what you mean by empowerment as a
Sure.
framework, as a starting point for our conversation.
Sure. So when people feel like they have the ability to influence an outcome, they're empowered, right? To me, that's how I define it, right? And that our people, believe, not just that they have the ability to influence the outcome, but they believe they have the ability, right? So it's not enough for us as a leader to tell them, they have to actually believe that they can, right? And at the end of the day, how do people, right, get that belief? That it's by making decisions, by having the autonomy and the authority to make decisions over their work and feel like, hey, I made that decision had this impact that, right, influence the outcome, I'm actually contributing here, right? Because what's interesting, right, we see so much when people talk about creating an engaged workforce, right? I mean, all I see is, well, it's about, do we have the right perks in the break room, and work life balance, and are we talking to them nicely, like really nicely, right? And are we giving them awards and recognition? At the end of the day, none of those things are what determines how much discretionary effort somebody gives at work, right? What determines your discretionary effort is, do you believe in the vision of the organization, and do you believe that your efforts actually influence it,
Make a
right?
difference. Absolutely. Yep.
And so the connection between decision making and that empowerment is, right, if I want more authority and autonomy, I have to be good at making decisions, right? And frank, if I'm not good at making decisions, I should not get more autonomy, right? I should get less, and I should have to be coached. And so, when I have struggled with organizations, teams in my past, that where there were the opposite of an empowerment culture, they were, I'll call it codependent, right? In the best case, right? Micromanagement might be the evil word for it, where the leaders, doing it on purpose. We'll call codependency is the state where people have just said, I don't want to make this decision, right? I want the leader to make the decision for me. I would rather just be told what to do, right? And so building up their skill sets and decision making, if you want to get out of that mode, is just really critical.
So if empowerment, and I would agree with
Mhm.
you, by the way, that it's that people feel they can influence the outcome.
Mhm.
Uh, Most every leader would say, "Well, I want my team to be empowered."
Yeah.
Like there are a few, they're not likely watching or listening to us, but there are a few that for whom that's not true. And
100%.
yet there's still a disconnect, right? There's a disconnect between people professing that's what they want and
Yes.
being able to actually create the fact or the feeling of empowerment. Why is there this disconnect? Why is
Yeah.
there a difference between what we would like to do and what we actually execute?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the short answer is the capability of the people to do that, right? I mean, yes, you want to give them more authority and autonomy, but um, you have to believe that they are going to be able to make good decisions, right, with that autonomy and authority, and to believe that they actually have to be able to, right? So, I mean, here
It can't
it
just
is.
be I believe in you or I believe in your potential, although that's an important piece.
Yeah,
They actually have to have the resources and the
yeah.
capability, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So to your point, like, so as I mentioned before, if you look out there, the conventional wisdom is that most micromanagers, right, are micromanagers, because of some personality defect, right? They're either narcissists, they're control freaks, they're whatever, right? Like they just want to be in control. But to your point, I know very few leaders that's really the truth, right? Well, and if you just think from a practical standpoint, why would you want that? Like, who wants to be called at 2 o'clock in the morning, to make every decision? I mean, my first plant I managed, my predecessor was very much a micromanager. And my wife literally would ask me, "Will you just go sleep on the? If the phone's going to ring all night, will you just sleep on the couch? Right? Like this, we can't live like this, right?" And I said, "Hey, I'm trying to get out of it, but apparently that's how things are done here, right? Like apparently nobody can do anything without talking to me first, and I have to figure out why that is and fix it." But my experience where most leaders go wrong is that they just try to stop that without fixing the underlying capability gap, right? So in other words, if I just told those guys, "Hey, stop calling me at 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't understand why you're calling me in the middle of the night. Don't call me at 2 o'clock in the morning anymore," right? Well, what would have happened? Likely a bunch of really bad stuff was going to
Or
happen in the middle
nothing
of
would
the night.
happen, which was gonna be bad stuff too, right?
Exactly. And then my boss would have been like, "What the heck is going on, Chris?" And guess what we would have been right back to? "You're calling me for everything in the middle of the night," right? And so if I hadn't sat back and said, why are we not confident in our decision making in the middle of the night, right? What is happening? And how can I get us both you confident in your ability to make the decision and my confidence in your ability to make the decision? How can we get there as quickly as possible so that we don't have to do this anymore? Because it's not fun for me, and and you don't like it either.
I love that you just said it. I want to underline it for people that
Mhm.
if they missed it because they're on the treadmill or whatever. Um, your confidence and my confidence in you, if I'm the leader saying that, right?
Yes,
And either one of those can be the problem, right? And
absolutely.
and what you're suggesting is that if we give them, as the leader, if we give them the capability,
Yes.
then their confidence in themselves will go up, and then we have what I call the confidence competence loop. Like both feed on each other, and we move up from there.
Yeah.
So you talk about a different kind of loop. You call it the micromanagement doom loop, which you've just hinted at. But I'd like you to
Yeah.
outline. I mean, like if we just spent our time here and
Yeah.
people left understanding this, that would be worth everyone's time. We will do
Yeah.
a little more than this. But let's talk about what you mean by the micromanagement doom loop.
Sure. Yeah, it's exactly it's the scenario that I just described, right? It's when and look, again, like I said, I've seen this happen many times to both my this has happened myself trying to get out of a organization where this was the culture, right? It was wait for the plant manager. Everything was, "Hey Chris, that something broke. What do you want me to do about it?" Right? And then wait for me to tell them. You know. Um so the the challenge becomes when you're in that situation and you want to get out of that is you can't just you start saying, "Hey, listen guys, stop calling me for all these things, stop making these decisions," right? Or the typical, let's have the town hall, and we stand up in front of them in the town hall and tell them, "I want to empower you, I want you to start making more of these decisions." But we haven't done anything to say, well, what kind of decisions are we asking them to make? And are they capable to make these? Like, have they done this before? Do they know how to think through this problem? And how do they feel about having to do that, right? And so if we don't train them first, we just give them this new authority, then all of a sudden they start making a bunch of bad decisions. um, because I'm already in a position where, as a leader, where I don't have really time to coach. So they start making these bad decisions. I just override them because I don't have time to coach them. And now they're left feeling like, well, hey, you told me you wanted my input, but you just ignored it. And right,
I'm
right,
not really empowered after all, and there's no
right,
sense in me doing it. So they retreat, and
exactly.
and that forces you to make those decisions, et
Yeah,
cetera.
exactly. And that's why, so what I say to people, and again, this is why one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this is, look, I got labeled a micromanager and I couldn't be the farthest further from the truth that that's what I want to be, right? But I've had people on the outside in looking at me at times and label me as that and saying, "You don't understand. In the situation I'm in right now, I'm having to do this. I have to do this. If I don't do this, this team is going to fail. This plant won't even be here. There won't be a plant here." Right? there won't be a business here anymore. Right. So I've got to make these decisions for now because they were making such bad decisions. But I got to figure out a way to get out of this situation because otherwise I have no life. Right. And so, yeah, so that's where trying to disrupt this loop and saying we have to, it's not about the intentions of the leader, it's about building the capabilities of the people. But the problem is usually the leader doesn't have the capacity to build the capabilities on their own, right? Because they're already micromanaging, right? They're already having to make all the decisions. So we have to have a way to teach them that's scalable that can solve the capacity problem too.
It's like I live near Carmel, Indiana, which has the most roundabouts uh, per capita in the country. Maybe the most period, but the most per capita in the country. And it's like getting on the roundabout and not knowing when to exit, not knowing when
Mhm.
to roll off. Right? If we're in that loop, I want to. I want to empower them. I want to enable them, but I don't have time to do that because I got to keep making the
It's
next decision. And I'm in
yeah,
that loop and I'm going around in the circle and I don't know when to get
yeah.
off and I'm in the wrong lane and I can't get into the lane to get off. And I'm in this, you call it a loop. I'd almost call it a downward spiral.
It
And
gets worse, yeah.
yeah, it definitely can get worse. Now, you said something early in this that I think is really interesting, and I think is one of the other places that leaders get stuck. And that is, and you said it almost offhandedly as you kept going. You said, "What are the decisions that I want to empower them to make?" Right?
Right.
And so a lot of times once we say, "Well, you're empowered," which I always say,
Yes.
"Bully for you," if you haven't enabled them, etc. But um, you can't just make that blanket statement. You have to give them what the guardrails are. What are the boundaries?
Yeah.
What decisions am I empowering you to make? And when would I want you to call me at 2 in the
Right.
morning, right? So,
Yeah.
like, talk about that, and because I find that that's another place leaders get
Yeah.
stuck in the execution, is they're not really clear about which ones they do wanna empower people on and which ones they don't.
Yeah. Well, yes. It looks, and I again talk about this in the book. Actually, like I think it's in the very last chapter. I term this decision rights, right? So talking about first framing it as we should view people's authority to make decisions as as like almost like property rights. It's something they earn, right? Like the more you make good decisions, the more authority to make decisions you should get, right? And one of the biggest mistakes I see organizations making is that they basically peanut butter spread decision rights across the organization. So everybody at the same level or position has the same decision rights, right? So a plant manager might have $5,000 or $10,000, they can spend, right?
Signing
And
authority, right?
yeah, and everybody has the same decision authority, right? Or procurement agent or whatever, right? Same cash, decision rights. But the problem is what that was really telling me is I know the only thing I know for sure is there's a bunch of people in that organization that have the authorities to spend money they probably shouldn't. And there's a bunch of people that have less authority than they probably should. Right? Because they're probably, they're probably either better at making decisions than that or worse. So instead of making it the same, you know, like, change it, right? The more a person has continued to make good decisions, they should get more decision rights. So if I'm calling you up to make a, request to spend $10,000 three times in a row, and you're like, boy, the way you explained that request to me was great, you know, absolutely. I mean, if you said yes three times in a row, maybe my rights should be 20,000 now, right? But if you said no to me three times in a row because the ideas were ridiculous, maybe you should be saying, maybe you should be calling me to make $5,000 decisions, right? I mean, if this is your idea for 10, maybe we need to talk about five, right? So first off, vary them, right? And then, but second of all, think about for each role, to your point, what are the critical decisions we're making, right? So, look, a lot of my experience manufacturing environments. So obviously, cash expenditures is one thing, but what's our production schedule, right? Maybe some operations supervisors, they've been running the production floor for 10 years, and maybe they don't need to call me to make a change to the production schedule because they know what they're doing. But I got a new guy who's been here 2 months or been in the role 2 months. Maybe if he's going to make a change that's going to affect the schedule more than an hour, he needs to call me, right? And if after 3 times he's called me and requested permission to change the schedule, I didn't have to correct him. Now maybe it's 3 hours, right? And 6 hours, and continue to change it. But I actually included those in employees' individual roles, responsibilities, expectations, and then we called it decision rights. And we varied them by person. And we, every time we would sit down, a couple times a year to review your roles and responsibilities, we also reviewed your decision rights and said, how should we change those? Right? Do we feel confident? Should we make them bigger, or we're not feeling good? Maybe they're less.
Yep. They
Right?
are one of the responsibilities. It's just to describe. It's just specifically described. And one of the things that tell me
Exactly.
what you say about this, but one of my observations is when that's clear, it also using the example of the person who's been a supervisor for a couple of months, and you give them the ability to make a change to the schedule up to 1 hour, and then they make some good decisions, and you talk those things through, and you move it to 3 hours. That's incredibly valuable to them. And for
Absolutely.
them, I mean, it's the aspirational to go, hey, I can get this to 6, or I can get this to 9, or I can get this to a day, or whatever, can be extremely, pardon the word, empowering, right?
Oh
And
yeah. Yeah.
and energizing. So
Hey, look, I could tell you that 1,000% the day that the regional director of operations told me, Chris, your decision you don't need to call me for these decisions anymore. Your decision rights are not, they're 50,000, not 10,000, right? Like that felt better to me than any plaque I got at some award thing, right? Like, I mean, that was this person telling me, hey, look, I'm giving you my authority because I trust you as much as I trust myself at this point, right? And that means a lot. So
So the bulk of the book, beyond sort of this level setting and the big ideas that we've talked about, the bulk of the
mhm,
book, and I believe the bulk of your work, based on what you and I talked about before we went live, is about enabling people, giving them a framework, a decision making framework to help them
yeah,
make those decisions, enabling them to do a good job of making decisions to improve
exactly.
their ability, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we don't have time to go into all that, and that's one of the reasons why people need to buy a copy of Chris's book, Enabling Empowerment. Um, there are several steps there. Some of them are not going to really surprise people. I mean, obviously, we could go into depth on any of
Yeah,
them, but the last one is the one
yeah,
that I want you to talk about. So, like,
sure.
it says things like, defining the objectives, creative range of alternatives. What are the drivers? Like some of that stuff, super important. Lots of great ideas you give us to make that more granular. But it's the
Mhm,
last thing that you say that I think is really important, and it's show your work. What do you
yeah.
mean by show your work?
Yeah, yeah. Look, just document your decision making process is the biggest part. The one of the so in my book, right, one of the things I spent a lot of time talking about are the decision traps that influence all of our thinking. Right, back at the beginning of this, I opened this up by saying we aren't very good as humans at making decisions in uncertain and complex environments, right? And that's not just a throwaway statement. That's a scientific fact, right? Our brains are not wired for that. And we have but it is a skill that we can develop if we are intentional about it, right? And so one of the decision traps we're susceptible to is hindsight bias, which is that we tend to believe that it was possible to know more than we could have at the time we made a decision. And so it's just really important when you're making the decision that you're in today's world of uncertainty and complexity, we're going to have to make assumptions, right? And so if we write those down when we make them, then later in the future we can go back and go, why did I make that assumption? And how could I maybe make a better assumption the next time? Right. So we can learn from those. And also not unfairly judge, right? Because one of the biggest mistakes leaders make is, judging a decision based on an outcome, right? Which and I'll say that and people, well, yeah, we should, right? Okay, so if I walk into a casino and I throw $1,000 on the black on the roulette table and I win, did I make a good decision? I mean, no,
Had a good
right?
outcome.
Right, right. The other one I say to people all the time. I mean, if I go out to the bar on Friday night and I get loaded and I drive drunk on the way home and I end up home safe and didn't have to pay for cab fare and have my car parked somewhere overnight, did I make a good decision? Absolutely not. That's a terrible decision, right? So you can't judge a decision based on its outcomes. You have to judge a decision based on the information that was available at the time and what the person did with it. So show your work so that in the future, when you want to go back and evaluate your decision, you know, you've
Here's
protected.
how we got there.
Yeah,
Context matters here, right?
right.
Here's how we got there. Uh, and then where did we fall there, and what would we do differently
Yeah.
the next time? It's a big,
And then
big
then we can move away from, blame, shame, and train, right? And as a strategy to let's learn. Like let's learn why that decision turned out differently than we expected it would.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another one of those decision traps. I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's one other one
Yeah.
that I thought we'd talk about briefly before we
Yeah.
start to wrap up. And it's the curse of knowledge, which
Yeah.
applies to all of us as humans, but it certainly applies as leaders, because a lot of times as leaders, we think we're supposed to have the knowledge, right?
Yes.
Or we got promoted because we had the knowledge. So what do you mean by the curse of knowledge?
Yeah, the curse of knowledge just it means that once we as people know something, it's impossible for us to remember what it was like to not know that. Right? And it's just so hard because the greatest example of the frustration of it is I think, right, when you're doing like playing charades or something with a group of people, right? Once you've seen the thing, the answer, like why the person's acting, it's like so obvious to you why they're acting out what they're acting, and you can't understand why everybody else can't see it because it's so freaking obvious, right? um or even once you were looking at what somebody's trying to do and then you find the answer and you're like, well, duh, that was obvious. But because once you have that knowledge, you can't unknow it. And so I just what I think is so important in terms of decision making is, especially when you have other people involved in the decision, you can't make assumptions that they know what you know, right? Like you have to like, especially, I don't know, wise leader once told me, you know that his way he works is he believes two reasonable people will, given the same set of facts, will generally come to the same conclusion. And so when two people aren't coming to the same conclusion, that means we don't have the same facts. So let's figure out what we don't have on the table.
I'm not sure I completely agree with the first statement, but I do agree that asking that question will help us make sure that we are on that same playing field.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I said two reasonable people
Yeah,
will generally.
I got you.
Okay.
I got you.
Now, his caveat to that statement was, at the end of the day, I'm the boss, so I'm the reasonable one. So if we can't get all the same facts on the table here, then at some point my conclusion will be you're the unreasonable one. But
Gotcha. So is there anything, Chris, that I didn't ask that you thought I would or wished I would have asked?
no, man, no, it's been a great conversation.
All right, well then that's cool. I mean,
Yeah.
all that means is that you didn't think of one in the moment, because there's probably plenty. But let's move into the final piece of our
Sure.
conversation. I've got a couple of questions I ask everybody. First one is, what do you do for fun?
Well, for fun, I do a lot of fishing, mostly bass, freshwater fishing. I'm also a volunteer firefighter here, and I'm in a kind of a blend. I'm in northern Wake County. It's a little bit blended rural, so we're fairly dependent on volunteer firefighters up here still. So that's takes up a good bit of time, but it's fun and rewarding. So
Well, I'm glad to know that you didn't get the call during the last 30 minutes.
that's right.
And so the only thing you knew I was going to ask you for sure is, what are you reading these days, Chris?
Yeah. Well, look, one of them I'm reading right now, a book, Mindware by Richard Nesbitt. It's a book a lot of similar stuff that's in enabling empowerment about decision traps, a lot along the same lines of, um, a book I reference in enabling empowerment, which is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I'm fascinated with the kind of the way the brain works, right, and realizing um, all the influences on your thinking that are going on right from your environment, your context. And so Yeah, I can't get enough of like just different perspectives on, what can be influencing the way we think.
We'll have links to both of those in the show notes, as well as a link to Enabling Empowerment, Chris's
Yeah.
book with the subtitle, A Leadership Playbook for Ending Micromanagement and Empowering Decision Makers. Chris, where do you want to point people? Where can they learn more about your work? Where do you want to point them related to the book? Anything at all? Where do you want people to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the website, www.enablingempowerment.com, you'll find link to the book, which is available on Amazon. But also, there's a lot of templates that are referenced in the book. So I reference, like, hey, if you don't have a financial model that you use to evaluate, capital decisions, or right, there's a link to, you can download one that you can feel free to plagiarize, or templates for planning things out, or just tip sheets for how to better frame problems. There's a lot of resources available there, as well as recorded trainings and things too. So that'd be the place to go.
Enablingempowerment.com. So the question now I have for all of you, I'm done asking questions of Chris, but I have a question for all the rest of you. If you've been here before, you know what it is. Here it is. Now what? What action are you going to take as a result of being here? Because what's the point, right? If we don't take some action, it might have been interesting, but it's not valuable until we take action. So whether it's now you have a new way to think about what empowerment means and how you would share that with your team, or maybe you need to think about how would I go about enabling my team, or maybe you need to think about how do you get out of blame, shame, and train. Maybe you want to think about decision rights. I don't know. Those are just a few of the things that I wrote down, everybody. But the most important thing that you can do as a result of being here is to take some action as a result. And I hope that you will do that. Chris, thanks so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. And I'm so glad we had the chance to chat.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin.
With that, everybody, I have just one more thing for you, and that is if you enjoyed the show, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss any episodes in the future. Wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast, make sure you're subscribed. If you have the chance to invite someone else to join us next time, do that. If you want to point people to this episode, of course, do that. If you have the chance to give us a like or a rating, we'd love that as well. But most of all, just make sure you come back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll see you then.